obligation, which is part of the European Union's principles, the European Union therefore decided to promote this political system abroad. And the European Union follows mainly three methods of action to promote democracy. I have already mentioned two of them, conditionality and sanctions, and the third focuses on support for civil society. Regarding conditionality and cooperation agreements, for example, again, the Cotonou Agreement can be an example, since after the coup d'etat in Central African Republic in 2003, the European Union decided on partial suspension of cooperation with regard to roads and macroeconomic support, according to, at that time, Article 96 of the Cotonou Agreement. But on the other hand, sanctions, which is the second way of action, are not common instruments used by the European Union to guarantee or promote democratic principles. In fact, the European Union has not adopted sanctions just for democracy promotion, since any references to the violation of democratic principles are always linked with human rights violation. In this regard, the recent restrictive measures against Nicaragua have been adopted because of human rights violation or abuses, or for the repression of civil society and democratic opposition in Nicaragua. And in the case of Myanmar, for example, the European Union decided to yet again implement restrictive measures because of the ongoing activities undermining democracy and the rule of law in Myanmar, as well as the brutal repression and serious human rights violations in the country. Therefore, it seems that one of the reasons why the European Union decides to adopt restrictive measures against non-democratic regimes rests in situations in which government's activities regarding opposition and civil demonstrations cross over into grave violation of human rights. In fact, there are no sanctions, for example, against Cambodia, Cuba, Azerbaijan, or Saudi Arabia. And finally, I will refer to the European Union Action Plan on Human Rights and Democracy and the action on strengthening civic and political space, and especially supporting civil society and human rights institutions through, among other means, funding grassroots organizations. For this purpose, the European Endowment Democracy can be used, which is a grant-making organization established by the European Union and the member states, and in order to create an international trust fund to foster democracy. Through this type of instrument, the European Union funds organizations or individuals that do not support the government in the country. And some non-democratic governments have considered this a way to funding political opposition. According to the General Assembly resolutions regarding the principle of non-intervention and propaganda, it seems that these actions are forbidden when the purpose is to organize, assist, foment, finance, incite, or tolerate subversive, terrorist, or armed activities directed towards the violent overthrow of the government. And in this regard, if we take into account that resolution, the European Union, we could say that had those statements in mind when creating the European Endowment Democracy, because according to the statutes, in order to be beneficiary of the aid of the European Union, it is necessary to hold core democratic values, respect human rights standards, and subscribe to principles of non-violence. And finally, regarding, I'm finished with this, regarding funding internal opposition in a country. Funding political parties is a matter that gives rise to some controversy, since according to some scholars, the practice shows that as long as it's not forbidden by the domestic law, it should not be considered an intervention. Nevertheless, by the same token, according to others, the tendency to fund parties through non-state actors may suggest that the state continue to have doubts about its legality. And the latter seems to be the position adopted by the European Union, actually, with this kind of action. So just to finish, the European Union actually has developed a deft system that allows them to comply with its international law obligations and at the same time to comply with its treaty obligation regarding the promotion of the European Union values. I'm finished. I'm sorry for the delay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Fernandez Arribas, for your interesting presentation about the interaction and with the principle of non-interpretation and the instrument of the European Union to promote human rights and democracy. Well, now I'm also very pleased to introduce the next speaker on my left, Professor Joan David Janer. Professor Janer is Professor of Public International Law in the Law Faculty of the University of Balearic Island. He has a law degree, PhD in law, legal master in European Union law in the College of Europe, and also he had a Jean Monnet chair in European Union law. He has carried out research stay at the European University Institute, University of Cambridge, University of Oxford, University of Manchester. He has been also evaluator of research projects, scholarship and grants of the Catalan Agency for Management of University and Research Grants, and also for the Spanish Research Agency. He has also been peer reviewer of the Spanish journal Revista Española de Derecho Internacional and the Spanish also journal Revista General de Derecho Europeo. And Professor Janer is going to talk about the European Union trade policy as a tool to promote human rights. You have the floor. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Muñoz, for your presentation. And well, first of all, I want to thank Professor Hinojosa and Professor Perez and also other members of the organizing committee of this conference and for allowing me to present this paper. Well, in this presentation, I will talk about the EU trade policy as a tool to promote human rights. However, I will focus on one. There are three mechanisms of trade policy to promote human rights, and I will just basically focus on the generalized scheme of preferences. Well, as you know, Article 3.5 of the Treaty of the European Union clearly establishes the obligation of the European Union to promote in its relations with the rest of the world the protection of human rights, and therefore Article 21.2b refers to human rights as a key element that has to inform the different policies of the European Union when they are projected ad extra. Well, the European Union has attempted to foster the nexus between trade, development, and human rights by gradually integrating human rights into its trade and development policies from the 90s onwards. Recently, as has been said, the adoption of the EU Global Human Rights Regime and the EU Action Plan on Human Rights and Democracy 2020-2024 clearly show the EU's global commitment to promoting human rights in its external action. Trade policy is certainly one of the EU's major instruments used to promote fundamental rights in the world, and specifically in developing countries. Just take into account that the European Union is the world's leading trading power, with 20% of international trade and 30% of investment. President von der Leyen stated in 2019 in its Agenda for Europe that trade is not an end in itself, it is a means to deliver prosperity at home and to export our values across the world, including the highest standards of climate, environmental, and labor protection, with a zero-tolerance policy on child labor. Well, the European Union has essentially resorted to three types of trade policy instruments through which, along with other objectives, has intended to export its values to trading partners. In fact, EU trade policies have increasingly linked access to its market to compliance with the so-called non-trade policy objectives, such as human and labor rights, environmental, climate, and good governance standards. These objectives has been pursued through trade agreements. I think it's a pity that Professor Cadus was not here to talk about them. The regulation of certain products exports, and the granting of generalized preferences to certain countries. In fact, these trade tools can be used as a carrot and a stick mechanism to incentivize trading partners to achieve non-trade policy objectives. Well, the reference to human rights in trade agreements, with over 40 agreements in force, the European Union has the largest trade network in the world. Is part of the general practice since the 90s by the European Union of including, as been said, the so-called human rights clause in the agreements concluded with third countries. The human rights clause built into EU bilateral agreements, also called democracy clause, as it refers to democracy as well, is phrased as an essential element clause which allows parties to partially or fully suspend or terminate an agreement unilaterally in case it is breached. The adoption of export control measures by the European Union states of certain products that can be used to commit human rights violations constitutes another example of the relevance of their respect in the Union's trade policy. In this sense, the European Union has prohibited its states from selling products that can be used in third countries to apply the death penalty or to inflict torture or other cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment or punishment, and it has also prohibited its states from granting export licenses for military technology and equipment to countries that could use them for the purpose of internal repression, that is, to violate the human rights of their civilian population. However, I will devote my presentation to the third autonomous trade policy instrument closely linked to the development cooperation policy that the European Union has used to promote respect for human rights, the granting to third countries of the generalized system of preferences. The GSP is a trade program which has been in place since 1971, enabled by the WTO trading system, and is designed to promote growth in developing countries through offering non-reciprocal preferential treatment, such as zero or low duties on imports to products originating in developing countries. The fact that a developing country can take advantage of the GSP will allow it not only to access the Union market without having to pay tariffs or submit to the quantitative restriction that it may establish, but it will also allow it to benefit from certain more favorable rules of origin, the establishment of particular mechanisms for the settlement of disputes through joint bodies, or the establishment of a specific criteria for the application of safeguard measures. Only two, the European Union and the United States, of the 11 different trade actors such as Australia, Belarus, Canada, Iceland, Japan, Kazakhstan, New Zealand, Norway, the Russian Federation, Switzerland, and Turkey, that use GSP trade schemes, condition eligibility of these trade preferences to some degree and in different ways on compliance with human rights standards. Although since 1971 the European Union has granted preferential tariff treatment to manufactured and agricultural products from poor countries, since the second half of the 90s it has made its concession conditional on the application in beneficiary countries of certain social and environmental policies. The design regime has evolved to the current GSP regulation that establishes different mechanisms of active nature, positive conditionality, that implies that the granting of a special tariff regime is that implies that the granting of a special regime if there is a clear commitment to respect certain human and labor rights, others related to environment, and others with good governance, and reactive, negative conditionality that implies the withdrawal of generalized preferences if a beneficiary country does not respect certain human rights. In this sense, the GSP concession has a double objective. On the one hand, it aims to help the development of poor countries, and on the other, it seeks to improve the political and social situation of the beneficiary country. The current EU GSP framework is based on Regulation 1978-2012 and offers 3 GSP arrangements covering a total of 71 countries. The standard GSP is designed for low and lower middle income countries which are granted a partial or full removal of custom duties. The GSP Plus is a special incentive arrangement for sustainable development and good governance, which slashes tariff to 0% upon ratification by the beneficiary country of 27 United Nations and International Labour Organization Convention on Human Rights, Labor, Environmental, Climate, and Good Governance. And finally, the EBA regime, Everything But Arms, granted to least developed countries which benefit from duty-free, quota-free access to EU market for all products except arms and ammunition. The commitment of the beneficiary countries with human rights is particularly important in relation to the GSP Plus scheme, as those countries have to ratify and effectively implement an important number of international conventions on various human rights, but also have to follow the reports of the monitoring bodies of those conventions and cannot formulate reservations contrary or incompatible with the object and the purpose of those conventions. If the content of those conventions is not respected, it is possible to withdraw temporarily the benefits of the GSP Plus regime in respect to all or of certain products. Together with the specific temporary withdrawal regime for the GSP Plus regulation, the current regulation maintains the possibility of temporarily withdrawing the 3 preferential arrangements in case of a serious and systematic violation of the 15 conventions on labor and human rights listed in the annex of the regulation. Also, in case of export of goods made by prison, in case of failure to comply with International Convention on Anti-Terrorism and Money Laundering, and in case of serious and systematic infringements of the objective adopted by regional fisheries organization or any international arrangements to which the Union is a party concerning the conservation and management of fisheries resources. Certainly, the European Union has designed at a theoretical level a system of tariff preferences in which special attention is paid to respect for different human rights, and a reaction mechanism is arbitrated in the event of their infringement by the beneficiary country. The question that should be raised is which has been the practical projection of the negative conditionality mechanism set up in the GSP regulation. Well, the reactive practice developed by the European Union during almost a quarter of a century of the GSP regime has been very scarce and has been limited basically to 4 countries: Myanmar, Belarus, Sri Lanka, and recently Cambodia. The first 2 countries benefit from the general tariff regime. Sri Lanka benefit from the GSP Plus regime, and Cambodia from the EBA regime. In the case of Myanmar, the Commission decided to withdraw temporarily the GSP benefits because the authorities resorted to forced labor for the construction of infrastructure for civil and military use. In the case of Belarus, it was considered that this country did not adopt measures to comply with the freedom of association and protection of the right to organize and the application of the principles of the right to organize and collective bargaining. As regards Sri Lanka, The partial withdrawal was due to the lack of implementation of United Nations Convention on Human Rights, such as the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the Convention for the Prevention of Torture, or the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Recently, the Commission has partially withdrawn the benefits derived from the EBA regime to Cambodia due to the deterioration of democracy, respect for human rights, and the rule of law in that country. The withdrawal is certainly the last resort, and it is used only in case of failure of previous negotiations. El Salvador and Bolivia were also investigated, but finally those countries decided to solve the problems identified by the Commission. During the 90s, the European Union also considered the temporary withdrawal of tariff preferences to Pakistan, India, China, and Russia. The current scheme set up in Regulation 1978-2012 shall apply until on 31st December 2023, and unless a new regulation is adopted, the standard GSP and the GSP Plus arrangement will cease to apply on the 1st January 2024. Imports from developing countries under standard GSP and GSP Plus would thus be charged with higher duties, and with the exception from the countries covered by the EBA arrangement, which does not have an expiry date. Therefore, on the 22nd September 2021, the Commission presented a new GSP regulation proposal aimed to renew the scheme for the next 10-year period, 2024-2034. The new proposal maintains the existing standard GSP and the two special regime of preferences, but from the perspective of the promotion of human rights, introduces new labor, environmental, and climate instruments that have to be ratified and implemented in order to benefit from the EU GSP scheme, for example, the Paris Agreement. The Commission proposal updates the list of relevant conventions in order to better reflect the evolution of core international instruments and standards. It also takes a proactive approach to sustainable development in line with the Sustainable Development Goals and Agenda 2030. The proposal introduces 6 new conventions to the list of international instruments which become the framework reference for the EU GSP scheme. We had 27 EU and ILO conventions, and now we will have 32 international instruments on human and labor rights, good governance, and climate environmental protection, which must be effectively implemented by beneficiary GSP countries. The new framework for the next 10 years also emphasizes and reinforces the monitoring and implementation of the obligations assumed for the purposes of the withdrawal of tariff preferences. The regulation proposal maintains the existing regime concerning the temporary withdrawal of tariff preferences. However, new Article 19 allows the withdrawal in case of export of goods made by internationally prohibited child labor and forced labor, including slavery and prison labor. It represents a step forward in the protection of human rights of children if we take into account that the current Article 19 just refers to export of goods made by prison labor. New Article 19 also introduces a withdrawal criterion related to the non-readmission of own nationals. As concluding remarks, let me say that the fact that the European Union and also the United States as the world leading trading power has linked the granting of tariff preferences to the ratification and effective compliance with various international conventions on human rights, labor, environmental, and governance rights constitutes, I think, in itself a very relevant aspect. The EU does not pretend an exterritorial application of EU law. On the contrary, the beneficiaries countries are required to comply with the obligations contained in multilateral international legal instruments, and it will be the monitoring bodies of those agreements that will determine the degree of compliance. One of the main advantages of the GSP scheme is that they are offered on a multilateral basis, which affords another more leeway in using conditionality by preference granting countries. Through its GSP programs, the European Union can reward countries that make progress on non-trade policy objective by offering lower tariffs and broader product coverage. The regime designed by the European Union combines at the theoretical level positive and negative conditionality as a way to promote human rights through the GSP as an autonomous trade instrument. The Union has built and designed an increasingly complete framework by expanding the spectrum of conventions and the obligation to ratify and comply with them effectively of positive conditionality that has dissociated itself from the conception of human rights that it may have by making reference to the right recognized in agreements concluded within the United Nations and the International Labour Organization. The beneficiary countries of the different preference regimes assume, therefore, that an essential aspect of the tariff advantages they enjoy is that they respect different human rights, different human, labor, environmental, and good governance rights. From this perspective, the design regime promotes, in line with other foreign policy instruments drawn up by the Union, the promotion and observance of human rights in third countries. This is complemented by the possibility that the Union withdraws, not permanently, but temporarily, either totally or partially, for all or part of the products, the advantages derived from the granting of both general regime and the special regimes in the event of serious and systematic violations of the rights provided for in the arrangements that the beneficiary state is obliged to ratify and comply with. The existing of a reactive mechanism can be a way to also promote respect for human rights in the beneficiary country as long it is applied in an effective, forceful, and real way, something that has not happened in view of the existing practice. And I'm finishing. The fact that the tariff preferences to Myanmar, Belarus, Sri Lanka, and Cambodia have only been partially withdrawn, when there were reports from the ILO itself indicated that certain countries that appear on the list of GSP beneficiaries did not adequately comply with the obligations derived from the ratification of certain agreements drawn out within the framework of the organization itself, highlights that the Union is very reluctant to suspend the system of tariff preferences in case of violation of human rights. The adoption of a reactive measures of a punitive nature is really an exception, which can undermine the credibility of the Union itself and lead to the beneficiary countries not taking seriously the observance of the conditionality regime linked to the enjoyment of tariff preferences. In any case, the conditionality regime designed in relation to the GSP must contextualize in the global policy designed by the Union aimed at promoting the observance of human rights in third countries, which has adopted a clearly proactive and not reactive approach. Indeed, the Union has resorted to the so-called soft unilateralism to try to promote respect for human rights in third countries through incentive and non-reactive policies. It makes sense if we take into account that the adoption of reactive measures has very pernicious effects on the civilian population, which not only suffers from human rights violation, but also suffers the economic consequences derived from the lack of access to the European market for its products. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Janer, for your also interesting presentation on the topic related to the conditionality in the European Union external action. And now the audience has the floor, and also I think that we have some comments on the web. So
many thanks to both speakers for your presentation. I would like to ask Professor Janer, do you really think that the EU has now an objective system? Because when it was, the GSP plus, to what extent is an objective system? Because when it was presented, I think around 15 years ago by the Commission argued we have for the first time in history GSP plus that is going to be objective, because in the past it was more subjective, as you pointed out. Now the countries that benefit from it have to ratify a number of instruments, and also to implement the reports from international organizations. However, as you said, the EU is reluctant to withdraw the benefits. So my question is, to what extent the EU has really an objective system, or whether we continue with a subjective framework as regards the ESP, and in particular the ESP plus?
Well, thank you very much for your question. Well, the Commission refers to the monitoring bodies of those conventions when he has to decide whether to withdraw partially or complete partially or not the GSP benefit. Well, I guess that at the end, obviously, there is a political decision whether it is necessary or politically convenient to withdraw GSP, country from the GSP, and that's why also, I mean, many scholars has criticized this lack of coherence of the Union itself when some countries are punished and others are not. Well, but that I think this also happens in general in the field of human rights, because if we take into account the application of the human rights clause in trade agreements, you can see clearly and that basically only the countries from Africa has been the suspension or the adoption of measures on the grounds of trade agreements are those countries from Africa. Nobody has thought about suspending the cooperation with Israel, for example, while there is an association agreement, and other countries. So obviously the Union, I think, with reason, has been criticized by the fact of lack of coherence, but I think at the same time that the important thing is that the Union has designed an important number of instruments, and I think for the Union itself, and I take into account that the human rights, I think it's the only organization itself that has the mandate to promote human rights, not only within but also externally. I think in itself that it has to be, it's an important thing. And well, returning to this thing of on human rights, you know that from 1997, there is a cooperation agreement with Russia, and I haven't seen that the Union has not talked about suspending or adopting any measure based on this agreement. We have taken many measures against sanctions, etc., but I mean, I've been shocked by the fact that there is an association agreement, cooperation agreement with Russia, which says in Article 2 that human rights, fundamental rights, and Helsinki Act is one of the main elements of the agreement, but no decision has been taken concerning the agreement. Yeah, but I agree with you that at the end there is a subjective approach to this, to whether to withdraw or not the GSP. Yeah.
Good afternoon, and thank you all for your presentations. I would like to ask you a question a bit related with the last topic of the GSP. In your view, the GSP sets best incentives to promote human rights standards and labor standards than compared to new generation agreements, new generation trade and sustainable development chapters included in those agreements. In your view, Professor Janer especially, which instrument is better placed to set the appropriate incentives to achieve better human rights and labor standards compliance in third countries? The GSP and with these 3 layers, or the new generation agreements? That would be the question. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Well, I think that the most important advantage of the GSP regime is the fact you have a 32. Well, if the new proposal comes into force, we have 27 United Nations and ILO agreements, conventions. We will have 32, and I think that the good thing is that well, for those countries which are most of them, those who benefit from the GSP Plus regime, they have to ratify, implement them. And in any case, for the 3 arrangement scheme, if there is a violation of human and labor rights, it is possible to withdraw them. I think from this perspective, this carrot and stick mechanism is the most convenient one, and it is based on a unilateral decision of the GSP is not a bilateral regime. Is a unilateral regime that the European Union decides to benefit a country if the country introduces and does a number of things. While in the bilateral agreements, maybe there is no reference to international convention specifically, and there is no obligation to ratify a number of conventions. So maybe I think that they also can be quite useful for developing countries, because trade agreements are more. The beneficiaries are wider, I think.
Thank you very much. I will let just one question and one experience. Edith Stash at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs Human Rights Office, and we have the work to help the stagiaires, to the diplomats, in something which is called the UPR, Universal Periodical Review, which means every 5 years countries are look at what advance they have done in these human rights. So the big issue for my colleagues and me is like, we were told by the diplomats, look, this country last year has done this, so, we have to tell them that we have done this, okay, but they have to respect all these conventions, and some conventions that nobody fulfilled, some of them obviously there's not been signed all the parts, but when we have to do the EPR of Arabia Saudita and China, it was a different approach, because it was the main thing with Khashoggi, and sometimes it's like the economic part, the political part, and what can be said to those countries that at the end of the day you do not spoil the agreements. My question here is, and the funny thing was between colleagues, like, oh my God, you have Arabia Saudita, vaya marrón, so that kind of approach. But the thing is, like, we are talking here as in Africa there wouldn't be any court of human rights, and my question is, does the European Union respect in that link what it's been said in this? It's like in the same way that the European Court of Human Rights, but in Africa there are also other courts that should be respected, because sometimes we also talk here as either in Africa wouldn't be that many courts, or even in some occasions they are a bit more developed in human rights regarding, for example, to family. That's one thing. And the last conclusion is, couldn't be the European Union made one way of doing is like some kind of como etiqueta, that in some photos has been taught one level to make things Bangladesh respect this is done not by child labor, and this has been discussed in many forums regarding to human rights and enterprises, and Spain is one of the government that is pushing this thing of human rights and business, and we are working quite on that. So wouldn't be something like practical to say, okay, we buy these products, but it has to be this level that is being done without labor, child labor, without, do you know what I mean? It's not only this convention, this level, but something practical that when we import and export, the companies know in some practical way whether should buy these products or not, or whether the standards, the European standards, are good enough to either import or obviously have this international agreement. Thank you very much.
I think
I'm so sorry I haven't explained it properly.
no. Well, concerning the regional court of on human rights in Africa, I think I haven't seen any reference. I think basically the European Union, in the framework of the Cotonou agreements, applies the information that could have us regarding respect for human rights in Rwanda, in Sierra Leone, in the different countries, and therefore decide to apply restrictive measures based on the agreement. But I think there is no reference to standards of regional courts on human rights. And concerning the level, I don't know that there is a lot of. I think there are a lot of things going on concerning enterprises and human rights and within the United Nations. But I think I don't know about really the level. Yeah.
If I may, just to add that I think there is a group also in the European society about a focus on this business and human rights. Perhaps you could also check this SEAL group.
Thank you. I would like to ask one question to both the speakers and also to the chair, because she's also quite an expertise in this conditionality. My question is so far the Court of Justice is not really a great actor in external conditionality, right? So do you think that Venezuela case law could change that in the sense of diverting or conveying part of the contentious stuff to the Court of Justice, and third state acting before the Court of Justice and challenging measures of conditionality, either unilateral conditionality or more political in that area?
Well, we were talking about that yesterday, and I have the same opinion as you, that to challenge before a Court of Justice political measures, because at the end these are political measures, can affect in a deep way the conditionality of the European Union, since every time that the European Union adopts a decision not only on conditionality, but in conditionality, I think that could be some kind of support on the agreement. We have some kind of trade agreement. So since conditionality is adopted inside that agreement, so we can find certain support. But for example, regarding sanctions, in that case, if in every case the state, not only the individual, which is already recognized, but the state can also challenge the decision, which at the end are, even though they are adopted in a legal act, they are political decision. I think that can affect and can hurt the system of the European Union, because it's going to be difficult to adopt decision, and in any case, if you adopt the decision and the decision is challenged, in the moment in which you can implement the decision, maybe the situation has already changed. So I think that yes, if this continue this path, we can have it can affect the activity and of the European Union in this subject, in this area. Yes.
Well, I think that I was an expert. I'm not, but I was. Well, it's just that, because it's due to my doctoral thesis that I, of course, focus on this subject and some other works. That I always remember that in the 90s, the decision by the Court of Justice about this first judgment, that it was about the cooperation, development cooperation. At that stage, it was really a very symbolic decision and very the key decision, in order to put forward the conditionality instruments in the European Union. But since that, of course, all the mechanism of conditionality mechanism has been improved, but we have many problems. And of course, we are always trying to make, I think, from the European Union, that we have to be the best in doing that. And perhaps we are very excellent with the European system. Sometimes for example, we don't research about what's happening in our own countries, from a national point of view, because we also have an external action and with instruments, and perhaps we don't know what does our government, or what happened at national level. So I think the European Union is a good example of it. With all this mechanism, I think that there is a clear positive evolution, including the role of the Court of Justice, but of course it's not a perfect and ended example of mechanism. I think that we are in a process, and perhaps we can exercise a kind of leadership at an international level, but we have many work to do. Anyway, I think that we have the legality and legitimacy, elements to do it. But of course, we have to improve, and in a way, with the experience, I think that more than 30 years working with conditionality, I think that we can affirm that we are a not very bad example for the rest. But of course, we have to improve. That's the only comments I would like to say.
May I? Yeah. Thank you. The chair has demonstrated that she is a specialist on conditionality since she did her PhD many years ago on this subject, and that's why she's there today. But she's very optimistic, and if you can allow me to make a pessimistic question that goes for both speakers. Even if human rights clauses, human rights and democracy clauses in conventions signed by the European Union, even if GSP preferences make reference to international conventions and standards, many developing countries still consider this social imperialism, environmental imperialism, democratic imperialism, why do you have to impose your concept of democracy, of rule of law, of independence of the judiciary to me? I have a different legal tradition, I have a different economy, I have a different social circumstances. So this is imperialism. And the basis for this accusation is even you, the European Union, have double standards. The accusation of double standards, you don't do this to China or to Saudi Arabia. You do this to Myanmar, to the African countries, to Bangladesh, because they are poor, weak countries. And this accusation of double standards is a blot, a stigma that is always there. So this gives lack of credibility to the effort that the European Union makes to disseminate these values. And it makes our life more difficult as a global actor compared to other big powers such as China that does not have this problem. So we trade with any autocratic country in Africa, and we get raw materials, and we make investments there, and we don't care about the government or what you do, or if you do not comply with human rights obligations or whatever else. So my question is there a good argument against this accusation of double standards? Or do we have to accept that we will apply double standards because we cannot do anything else, and when they accuse us of double standards we say, yes, but we try our best? Thank you.
I think you are clearly right. I think there is double standard. I remember, well, just take the example of Israel, no? The cooperation agreement, agreement with Israel. The European Parliament asked for the suspension of the agreement, and the European Council decided not to do anything. I think this is clearly an example of lack of coherence. Well, I mean, there is no coherence at the time of applying these reactive measures, and it depends on the country. It is true that, yeah, it's true.
Well, I agree on the double standard, but I think that is also based on the treaties, because we have a mandate that is to promote human rights and democracy and rule of law abroad. So we had to comply with that mandate, which is included in the treaty. I don't know if maybe we should reform the treaty and get out of the treaty that. But if we have it, we should at least try to implement it. And then it's come the second part, which is the political one, and the capacity that the European Union has in order to implement that mandate. It's true that you can implement it with weak states, so it's the way in which they are acting. So we are complying in some way with our mandate in the treaty, Article 2.3. I think it's in the external policy. And second hand, we can try to comply with our mandate regarding other states in such a way. It's true that we cannot take so hard or so affected the actions regarding some type of state, but at least there are some. For example, regarding Israel, there is no recognition of territories, and I don't know if I'm wrong, but we don't accept products from occupied territories as well. So it's a kind of action which is not the same as in any other state, but it's something at least. So I think that the European Union is, I don't know, navigating between legal obligation according to the mandates and the capacity of political capacity, actually, because it's something political that we have in order to implement that mandate. And it's true that this affects the image of the European Union abroad, and you can always have a state saying, okay, why me? Why are you taking those decisions against me? Why there are other states that are doing wrong or things that are worse than those that I'm doing. but I think it's part of the policy at the end, which is international policy, I think. So in external action, we cannot only think of legal issues, also on political ones. Yeah.
If I may, also just to, of course, I agree with Professor Hinojosa, but I would like to ask him who has no double standard. I'm sorry if I seem to look a little bit rude asking that question. Who has no double standard? And so the question is that to answer that, of course, we have double standard, we don't have any conditionality instrument. That easy answer is the answer that we have to give. I think that's no, it's not white and black. If we can also use sentence. I was now remembered that I think this evening a student from Togo that it's now in the room, and I think that also he wants to make a question. I think that he explained to us a positive experience in the framework of the Cotonou Agreement. So just to have a positive element that perhaps we have also to focus on the positive consequences. It's not perfect and a full and perfect, complete positive experience, but unless a part of, a partial positive with the conditional instrument. But as I think you wanted to make now a question, please make it. And we finish. Just the last question. Please proceed.
Okay. Thank you to the speakers for their presentation. My question is to Professor Yaner. Following the Cotonou Agreement, the European Union uses the Economic Partnership Agreement as a tool to export its essential and fundamental values that are human rights, rule of law, and all those things. These instruments are sometimes negotiated between countries taken individually or with regional economic communities. I mean, for example, EPA with ECOWAS. Now, my question is this. In the case, a member state of an economic regional community violate human rights enshrined in those instruments, what's happened? The withdrawal of benefits is targeted, or how is it made concretely? Toward the regional economic community or toward the country taken individually? The EPA is concluded either with a country, Togo, or ECOWAS, that is regional economic community of 15 countries. And my question is to know whether Togo violates a principle of the European Union enshrined in an economic partnership agreement. What's happened in that case? The withdrawal of benefit is toward the whole regional economic community or toward Togo? What is made in that case? That's my question.
Well, I think if you are referring to the Cotonou Agreement, there is a huge number of countries, European countries and African countries, and if I think that the violation of human rights is based on the personal behavior, attitude of a country. So it's not the whole countries as a whole, all the countries, but the country. I mean, if Togo violates human rights, the action is taken concerning Togo, even if it's a multilateral agreement. I don't know if that was a question. I mean, and Cotonou has, I mean, there are many countries which have signed the agreement, the European countries, but also African countries. So, I mean, if a specific country violates, is the country, I mean, the sanctions or whatever, the suspension, the termination of the agreement refers to that country.
Yeah, since the agreement is with the regional economic community, not an agreement with a country, but with the whole regional community, like European Union that is composed of many countries, the regional economic community also has many countries. That's what
I think it's based on the individual.
what happened in that case. Withdrawal of interest is because of the behavior of one country.
Of one
The whole member state of community will suffer the same.
No, I don't think so. I think it's the individual country for its behavior.
Thank you so much.
Okay. So I think that we have to finish now this last roundtable. So thank you to the speaker and thank you for you. Gracias, chicos. Muy bien, habéis sido escrupulosamente y os veía, porque os veía las páginas, digo, van muy bien, pero claro, mi deber de pasar el dichoso papelillo que sé que pone un poquito nervioso, porque a mí me lo genera ese nerviosismo. Pero habéis sido escrupulosos, 20 minutos cronometrados. De verdad.
No pierde la noción del tiempo cuando habla.
Por eso, es que en tu concentración es muy difícil, por eso es bueno que alguien...
Yo me lo he leído 50 veces lo que tenía que
Pero
decir.
yo estaba tranquila porque os veía los papers y, o sea, veía las hojas que ibais muy bien.
Bueno, muchas gracias.
Por animar el cotarro, claro.
Vamos tarde.
Luis,
Eso no-
¿vas a necesitar el portaaviones? ¿Cómo? ¿No vas a necesitar el portaaviones? No.
Mira, eso no se ha tocado, esa jarrita de agua se puede dejar, no se ha tocado.
Aquí en el grande.
Y directamente lo ponemos.
Where is my place? The big chair is for you.
Wow.
It's for me a pleasure to introduce Professor Jan Boters in the last act of this conference. As I already announced yesterday, this will be an ESIL lecture. So for those of you that are not familiarized with the European Society of International Law, let me explain that this is an initiative that allows prominent scholars to reach a wider audience by publishing in open access a lecture of excellence. This has produced an excellent collection of videos available to any person interested in international law or in European law that projects a European voice, which is very important, on some of the most important matters regulated by international or European law. I would like to thank the European Society of International Law for having accepted our proposal and including this keynote lecture in the series. And of course, I would like to thank Ian Wouters for agreeing to deliver the lecture. Professor Wouters is a very well-known scholar. He is full professor of international law and international organizations in the Catholic University of Leuven, Jamon Chair ad personam, and founding director of the Institute for International Law and of the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies. Professor Wouters is also a member of the Royal Academy of Belgium for Sciences and Arts and practices law as of counsel in Linklaters in Brussels. He is editor of the International Encyclopedia of Intergovernmental Organizations, deputy director of the Revue Belge de Droit International, and an editorial board member in 11 international journals, if this has not changed since the last time I counted. I could go on and use the 40 minutes reserved for his lecture, summarizing his many and outstanding professional achievements, but I will limit myself to mention that he is coordinator of the Horizon 2020 project Reconnect, that is, this means reconnecting Europe with its citizens through democracy and rule of law, and this is the reason why we have asked him to be here today to somehow recap the bulk of the debates that we have had these 2 days, but above all, to give us his knowledgeable perspective on the real capacity of the European Union to enhance the rule of law in Europe and the world. So Jan, this is your mission today. I hope it's not a mission impossible. You have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your kind introduction. It's a great honor and pleasure to be back in beautiful Granada, which I visited for the first time on my bicycle at age 15. It's quite a while ago. And I also want to sincerely congratulate the colleagues for their impeccable organization of this beautiful conference. So let me introduce with some dramatic statements. Since the 24th of February of this year, the world and Europe have changed. If we had held this conference as it was initially planned 2 years ago, or even just a week before that 24th, my lecture would probably have been a very different one. The Versailles Declaration, adopted by the EU heads of state and government on the 11th of March, calls Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, and I quote, a tectonic shift in European history, end of quote. Now, one always has to be very careful with what comes out of Versailles, which is itself a place of many tectonic shifts in European history. But this time, the heads of state and government captivated the historical momentum quite well. And that is that Russia, and I quote again from the declaration, Russia brought war back to Europe. Nous voilà. Now you may say, okay, it's horrible, but it is about a war of choice of an autocrat in the bad outside world, and that as such should not affect the internal respect for rule of law within the EU and its member states, nor the promotion of the rule of law in the EU's external action. What our discussions of the last 2 days were all about. Now, whether we like it or not, there are important linkages between what is happening with this war and those two topics. First of all, Russia's aggressive military actions, in my view, cannot be seen in isolation of the absence in that country of sufficient democratic and rule of law safeguards. We are facing a case of extremely centralized power in the hands of one autocrat one autocrat who has been the most powerful man in Russia for nearly a quarter of a century, and who procured himself a law changing the constitution that may keep him in office until 2036, and who has repeatedly and also recently threatened to use nuclear weapons. So in a way, this by itself is a big wake-up call of what the absence of rule of law and of real democratic checks and balances may do with a country and with the world. Secondly, there's something else, I'm afraid, that is happening. The European Union seems to have changed too. For the first time, the Union is supplying lethal weapons to a third country at its eastern border that is the victim of a brutal aggression of the largest country in the world. The Versailles Declaration also makes clear that the priorities of the European Union for the next years will all be about strategic autonomy. Even the Macronian words of European sovereignty found their way to the text of the declaration. So it will all be about strategic autonomy, be it in defense, be it in energy, in economics, or even in agriculture. And last but not least, speaking of the changing nature of the EU, just a few days later, it already became clear that the European Commission itself is changing its priorities. It is quickly deprioritizing its actions to protect the rule of law within the most problematic EU member states. Solidarity with those member states that are now admittedly taking in millions of refugees, that is now the first priority. So, rule of law backsliding, let's not focus too much on it right now. Still, in my lecture, I will first of all try to show that upholding the rule of law within the European Union should remain a stark priority for the Union. And why? It's actually a very simple message, as old as the Bible. A house that is divided against itself cannot stand, and it can definitely not shine in the world. I will share in that respect with you the findings of Reconnect, as announced, a Horizon 2020 research program of which I am the coordinator. We have worked for 4 years with 18 partner institutions from 14 countries to analyze what has gone wrong regarding the rule of law and how we can better, and that's the full name of this acronym Reconnect, how we can better reconcile Europe with its citizens through a stronger commitment to democracy and the rule of law. After sharing with you some of our main analysis, findings and recommendations, I will return to the question of the EU's role in promoting the rule of law in the wider world. That may indeed well be a mission impossible, but again, in the light of what has happened since the 24th of February, I think there is a lasting and urgent necessity to still go for it. So let me start with the main findings and recommendations of the Reconnect project. At the center of that Reconnect research has been the disconnect that exists between the Union and its citizens. And we know for many years what disconnect we are talking about. We talk about the lack of real trust of citizens in Europe, the gap between Europe and its citizens, and so on. And indeed, there is this crisis of trust, and I think to start with, I should contextualize that crisis of trust again a little bit and quickly revisit some of the profound changes that democracy and the rule of law are currently facing in the EU. I will touch both on democratic challenges and rule of law challenges because I have been convinced in our Reconnect project those two are not separated. They are closely intertwined. And after that, after this contextualization of the crisis of trust between Europe and its citizens, I will touch on the tools the toolkit, which according to our research is there and should be used by the Union to strengthen its foundational values and regain the trust of its citizens. And in doing so, I will explain briefly also how these tools have failed to provide resilience because they were not properly used. They have failed to provide resilience against the trends of democratic and rule of law backsliding which have been occurring in a number of member states. And then I will come to the final recommendations for what we consider the right way forward for the EU and its values, which are again based on the conclusions of our Reconnect research. We are now almost at the end of April the project ends, and we are really working hard to formulate those final policy recommendations and even, how unrealistic it may sound, some recommendations for treaty changes. But that will officially be launched at the end of next month. First, the crisis of trust. I don't need to tell this distinguished audience, because we have heard it time and again in our conference, that the EU is founded on a number of fundamental values, beautifully set out in Article 2 of the EU Treaty. Now, it's good to recall also that the commitment to respect, but also to promote these values, is actually a prerequisite for membership of the European Union, as made clear explicitly in Article 49 of the EU Treaty. And it is on this basis that the Court of Justice has held, and I quote from its judgment of the 15th of July 2021 concerning the disciplinary regime for judges in Poland, I quote the court's judgment: "The European Union is composed of states which have freely and voluntarily committed themselves to the common values referred to in Article 2, which respect those values and which undertake to promote them. In particular, it follows from Article 2 that the European Union is founded on values such as the rule of law, which are common to the member states in a society in which inter alia justice prevails." End of quote. This case law, interestingly, has been amply and explicitly referred to by the legislator in the preamble of the EU conditionality regulation of the 16th of December 2020. And that preamble adds to this that, and I quote, "the laws and practices of member states should continue to comply with the common values on which the Union is founded." End of quote. And this case law, as you may know, has been recently confirmed by the Court of Justice in its judgments of the 16th of February of this year in the Polish and Hungarian annulment proceedings against the conditionality regulation. There the court reiterates, again a brief quote, "Article 2 contains values which are an integral part of the very identity of the European Union as a common legal order and are given concrete expression in principles containing legally binding obligations for the member states." The court went on to say, as we already indicated, that the rule of law is a value common to the EU and the member states, which forms part of the very foundations of the EU and its legal order. End of quote. I will not quote the court again, but I wanted to do this at the beginning of my talk because the earlier arguments that we have heard quite a number of years from a couple of member states, that there is actually no real rule of law concept in the EU, or that the notion is too vague and not consensual enough, I think we can now say these have been swept from the table by these judgments. Fortunately so. But in the current context, one has to ask the question, is the European Union and are its member states still sincerely and fully engaged in adhering to and in promoting those fundamental values? Question mark. And there I come to our finding that in recent years the Union has faced a rather consistent trend of backsliding on both democracy and the rule of law in a number of member states. Of course, we always mention the usual suspects: Hungary, Poland, Romania, but in fact the picture is larger and more diverse. One thing is clear, this has placed the EU's foundational values under increasing pressure. Infringements upon the rule of law and democratic standards have manifested and continue to manifest themselves in a number of ways. What are the most apparent infringements? Impairments of judicial independence in terms of both national constitutional courts and other domestic courts and tribunals. Open attacks on independent media, on civil society, on independent universities, and increasing corruption and interference in public prosecutions in some member states. The Union has been criticized for its lack of willpower to adequately use the tools available to its institutions in order to tackle these forms of democratic and rule of law backsliding. It has been said that if the Union had used its current tools forcefully and soon enough, it might have been able to enforce compliance with democracy and the rule of law in member states quite a while ago. Now, let us also not forget that there are also challenges at the level of the Union itself. The EU has long been criticized for its own democratic deficit, a phenomenon that has, of course, been remedied to quite some extent, especially with the rise of the European Parliament as a co-legislator, but it still persists in some of the decision-making processes. There is still the criticism of the Commission for insufficient accountability, the lack of transparency, especially on the part of the European Council and the Council, the erosion of the role of national parliaments, and some other criticisms such as the lack of transparency in the negotiations and implementation of EU trade agreements. All of them, in a way, contribute to a poor democratic legitimacy track record of the EU as such. To add to this, successive crises, such as the financial crisis since 2008, the ensuing sovereign debt crisis of the Eurozone, then the migration crisis, security crisis related to terrorist attacks, Brexit, COVID-19, and now Russia-Ukraine, have in a way all contributed to eroding quite severely the legitimacy of the Union, and by association the trust of its citizens. So the essential question is, I repeat, how can the EU reconnect with its citizens? And so here I will come back later in my lecture to the global context. I'm not going to deal with that right now, but I want to highlight already that there is a global context out there in which the EU takes part. The EU is not in splendid isolation from that context with regard to rule of law backsliding and democratic backsliding. I'm going to keep that for the second part of my lecture. I'm going to highlight specifically now the internal problems that have surfaced. And they have to do with lots of things, with nationalism, populism, with intolerance also. And again, as I said, you cannot dissociate the rule of law backsliding from other problems regarding the quality of our democracies. Democracy, as we all know, is also one of the fundamental values of the EU. But our research with Reconnect has shown that actually there are amazing and significant variations in the quality of national democracies within the Union. Again, the usual suspects, Hungary, Poland, Romania, but again the picture is more diverse, right? But, and if I say the picture is more diverse, I should broaden it up to the current debates which we see in many member states as a reaction to the ever-growing powers of the European Union, which has resulted in multiple countries openly expressing their proclivity towards regaining and strengthening their national sovereignty and identity, sometimes under the guise of the term of constitutional pluralism. But this impulse, as we all know, came to a boiling point with the finalization of Brexit in January 2020, through which the UK withdrew from the EU to reclaim some of its powers and then similarly during crises such as the migration crisis, the COVID-19 crisis, we have seen time and again member states being inclined to favor sovereign and national approaches as opposed to common solutions. Our Reconnect research has borne out that one of the most worrying aspects of the decline in democracy in the member states is the deterioration of the quality of public discourse. What do I mean by that? Well, we found out also through empirical research that none of the other components of democracy have declined as quickly and as sharply over the past couple of years as the quality and the civility of public and political deliberation. The quality of public discourse is especially influenced by the failures to adequately explain actions, political actions to citizens, but also by the way in which political opponents are being portrayed, not as democratic competitors, but as enemies or illegitimate rivals. It's very worrying. A second worrying trend, maybe even more worrying, is the withdrawal of citizens from public participation and from participation in elections. Our research has analyzed factors that affect electoral turnout both at the national and the union level. When we compared the two levels, two patterns became visible. On the one hand, our research established that, and you know this, electoral turnout in European Parliament elections is always lower than the turnout in national legislative elections. On the other hand, the lines for both types of elections run parallel, meaning that the European Parliament elections still in the eyes of the citizens and of politicians remain what we call second order elections, always second order to national elections. And you would say, well, 2019 was better because indeed we had a record electoral turnout, but the sad reality is that all European Parliament elections since 1979, the first time, have displayed a lower turnout in comparison to the previous election. I'm not going to dwell on the recommendations that Reconnect makes to try to reverse this trend. They often depend on very practical things, such as, for instance, hold the election rather during the weekend than on a working day. You know, very obvious things, but people will go out rather on a Saturday or Sunday to vote than take time away from their working day. Questions of compulsory voting, holding national and EU elections concurrently, all of that tend to increase citizen participation. Now, I should add something to this. To assess more accurately the attitudes and the perceptions of European citizens, our Reconnect project has conducted a lot of empirical research on discussions about the EU among the citizens. How have we done that? Well, it's definitely not a legal methodology, it's political science. We have done that by organizing citizen surveys before and after the 2019 elections in 7 different member states, but also by consulting 12,000 citizens in 6 member states. We had to make choices, of course, to ask them how they think about things such as a further transfer of powers to the EU, solidarity between rich and poor member states, the role that citizens see for themselves in EU decision making, the policy areas where they would like the EU to take decisions in. And I want to briefly share with you 4 important insights that have emerged from those surveys, and which I think are really important for our considerations here. First of all, whether we like it or not, the first finding is citizens are divided over the question of transferring additional powers to the European level. They're also divided over the question of possibly repatriating sovereignty back to the national level. The option, interestingly enough, that seems most acceptable to a majority of citizens is a distribution of competences close to the current status quo. Interesting finding. Second finding, citizens are equally ambivalent regarding the idea of European solidarity in the form of redistributing wealth from richer to poorer member states. There are really great country differences on this question, and I don't think you need to have too strong an imagination to see differences between northern, southern, what have you, western, eastern countries in that respect. So that's the familiar division line between richer net contributors, the frugal countries, poorer net beneficiaries, and so on. So in other words, far-reaching reforms in the direction of more intra-EU redistribution are likely to meet with serious public opposition in some of those countries. Third finding, which policies should primarily be tackled by the EU? That's very interesting. Citizens clearly prioritize areas with an outspoken transnational character. Many policies that are favored by citizens are related to the perception of global threats. Think of climate change. Think also now of war. War is back in Europe. Suggesting that EU action could be framed successfully along the lines of what President Emmanuel Macron has called une Europe qui protège. And I would suppose that with the Russian invasion in Ukraine, this is still more the case today. Fourth finding, interestingly, there is wide support for more citizen participation and more transparency of EU decision-making processes. Citizens place high importance on the capacity of EU policies to solve problems, and they really appreciate the sharing and distribution of those benefits among all member states. Why is this also important? Because, as you all know, the EU's political system, read Article 10 of the EU Treaty, is primarily based upon the principle of representative democracy. That's like, and then Article 10 is beautifully formulated, trying to justify, let's say, the legitimacy of each of the institutions based on some particular kind of representative democracy. Not always that convincing, but it's there. Well, the question here, and I come back to that, is whether we should also, maybe partially, let's say, responding to some of the experiences in the Conference on the Future of Europe, whether we could not expand this democratic universe a little bit by paying more attention also to deliberative democracy tools, right? I come back to that in a few moments. In any event, with Reconnect, we really found this survey very, very interesting, and we say, well, this really has implications for future reform of the EU. Policymakers who want to cater to the wishes of European citizens, they should, of course, first of all strive to grant the citizens more channels of participation and improve their capacity, their ability to monitor political process at the European level. Moreover, those surveys show that framing the nature of the EU as a positive force against external threats is likely to resonate very well with many citizens. And that is maybe also what the Versailles Declaration does. Lastly, since citizens are divided over the balance of powers between the EU and its member states, I think that policymakers should probably be very careful and cautious about trying to change the current vertical distribution of power in the EU. Again, it will be very interesting to see what final recommendations are going to come out of the Conference on the Future of Europe in the coming weeks. I come to the tools to restore trust. What is this rule of law toolbox of the EU? Has the EU used it in a good way? Has it failed to use it sufficiently? Let me quickly go through that. You all know some of these things, and they have also been referred to at our conference. First of all, there are the treaty-based instruments. We've taken a look at the rule of law apparatus, and an overall finding is actually that there is no need to reinvent the wheel. That sounds obvious, but you may, if you have followed the rule of law debate in the European Union, there's always the tendency of some member states or some institutions to say, let's create an additional mechanism, and yet an additional mechanism, and so on. Before you know, it's a total, if you wish, chaos of overlapping mechanisms. Well, we think that actually the existing instruments are, broadly speaking, adequate to uphold the rule of law in the EU and its member states, even though we make a number of recommendations, for instance, regarding the formulation of Article 7 of the TEU. I come to that. So, we think indeed that overall there is no need to change things, but this is of course a critical prerequisite for this finding, is that the existing instruments are actually being used in a prompt, in a forceful, and in a coordinated manner. And that's precisely where the problem lies. That's not the case. A tool that has long been missing in the toolbox, and actually we identified it as Reconnect, was a mechanism aimed at protecting the Union's budget against member states that abuse EU funds to consolidate their backsliding practices. But as you know, that mechanism was precisely adopted in the form of the EU conditionality regulation on the 16th of December 2020, and as you know, only after a very lengthy impasse caused by vetoes by Hungary, Poland, but also, for instance, Slovenia. Now, besides this instrument, and as we have seen, the legality of that instrument has fortunately been cleared by the Court of Justice's aforementioned judgments of the 17th of February. Besides that instrument, Reconnect has also explored the other instruments that are available to the Union in its efforts to at least contain backsliding in member states. The current toolbox, as you may know, consists of Article 7 procedures, I'll come to that, infringement procedures, both Articles 258, 59, the cooperation and verification mechanism, and various soft law instruments, including the rule of law framework and the rule of law review cycle. Let me briefly share some reflections on these instruments. I think, first of all, regarding Article 7, it is an understatement to say that the procedures, because we talk of plural here, that the procedures of Article 7, which in theory are supposed to resolve breaches of the EU's fundamental values, have turned out to be very difficult to implement in practice. The preventive procedure under Article 7.1 was activated against both Poland and Hungary, but to trigger any sanctions under the so-called sanction procedure of Article 7, paragraph 2, you need the unanimous vote of all member states, apart from the state in question. And it just hasn't happened. While efforts have been made to commence an Article 7.2 procedure against both Poland and Hungary, the procedure has been crippled by the fact that more than one member state has gone the wrong way, right? And when Poland and Hungary are backing each other and prevent a unanimous vote of the member states, then Article 7.2 is basically a procedure that has been left dead in the water, unable to bring a halt to backsliding practices relating to rule of law and democracy. We argue with Reconnect that Article 7 should be used to its full potential, and that actually some changes are needed there. For instance, it should not foresee the participation in 7.2 of a member state that is already subjected to an Article 7.1 procedure. You see what I mean? There are some other changes we suggest in that respect. I come quickly to the unique tool that the EU has at its disposal with the infringement procedures. In the very first place, the Commission's role in Article 258. You know, the Commission can trigger that procedure against any member state considered to have failed in the fulfillment of an obligation under the treaties. And the Commission has indeed initiated proceedings under this article on multiple occasions against both Hungary and Poland. Still, strangely enough, we have found out that overall the Commission's use of infringement procedures has actually been declining in the past 10 years. You should read maybe some of the findings of our colleague from Rutgers University, Professor Dan Keleman, in that respect. Moreover, even in the infringement procedures that have been conducted, the Commission has very often taken a very cautious approach, using rather indirect legal arguments, such as the violation of non-discrimination legislation, even a violation of international rules such as the GATS, the General Agreement on Trading Services under the WTO, in order to protect the rule of law. Just out of fear also that, invoking Article 2, Article 19 and so on separately may simply not be accepted by the court. And worse, those infringement procedures were only designed to tackle one infringement of EU obligations at a time. Whereas efforts by the governments in question to undermine the rule of law and democratic protections often involve really multiple and systematic infringements of the EU's fundamental values. That's why Reconnect suggests that the Commission should rather also explore the potential of launching interconnected infringement actions based upon multiple articles, including Articles 2, 4, 3, of course, sincere cooperation, Article 19, paragraph 1, and some other treaty articles, maybe also charter articles, to defend judicial independence. I will not dwell really on Article 259, which, as you all know, is about the possibility about member states initiating an infringement actions against another member state. We know that this procedure has been barely used in the past because of its political sensitivity, but there is actually no reason why it cannot be usefully deployed in the context of rule of law backsliding. Member states should actually have an increased awareness of this provision and the possibility to invoke it against other member states. There is interesting news here. I mean, you may recall that in February of last year, the Dutch Parliament approved a motion on the implementation of Article 259 against Poland. And in June of last year, there was a draft motion introduced in the Belgian Federal Parliament as a response to the Hungarian anti-LGBTIQ legislation. Okay, that about treaty aspects. There is soft law. There are useful soft law instruments. The Commission since 2014 has its rule of law framework as a tool, which was viewed by it, at the time at least, as having the potential to act as a kind of simplified pre-Article 7 infringement procedure. It's not the only soft law instrument in the area of rule of law. There is, for instance, since 2013 also the EU Justice Scoreboard, which provides comparable data on the independence, the quality, and the efficiency of national justice systems. As we know, the rule of law framework was used for the first time against Poland in 2016. And although the activation consisted of one formal opinion and 4 formal recommendations, it has had little effect on backsliding practices in Poland. As a result, Commission had no choice but to trigger Article 7.1 TEU. In 2019, the Commission also issued a blueprint for action, again, the tendency of proliferation of mechanisms, in which it set out a new instrument called the Rule of Law Review Cycle. And that review encompasses all member states, not only those with ongoing rule of law concerns. I'm not sure if you have seen the 2 first reviews, 2020, 2021. I think they have potential. But we have deplored, as we connect, the rather euphemistic language. The language that is actually understating the gravity of the situation which is unfolding in multiple member states. And most of all, the failure to recognize the systemic nature of certain developments. It's too easy to say all member states have rule of law challenges. You know, this kind of banalization of the problematic. You have to distinguish maybe a little bit more the really dangerous systemic attacks to the rule of law from structural shortcomings in some member states, although those, of course, also need to be tackled. I come to some recommendations on the rule of law. I just list a couple of them, if I may. The Commission, we think, should focus on improving the current instruments and processes relating to the rule of law framework, bring more audacious infringement cases, and, of course, fully implement the EU conditionality regulation. As I've said in the beginning of my talk, The latter is already seriously under threat now because of the Ukraine crisis. There are some sector-specific recommendations, for instance, in the area of security, justice and freedom. The Commission, in our view, should introduce a mechanism that is really dedicated to regularly check Member States' compliance with the values underlying the mutual trust and put in place measures for an objective and impartial evaluation of the implementation of Union policies in this area in order to facilitate the full application of the principle of mutual recognition. I think it's really important because this cannot continue to work with the current tendencies in some member states. The EU Justice Scoreboard is very useful. We think it should be improved, making explicit that there are data gaps because the scoreboard depends on member states' willingness to share information about their judiciaries, and they're not all doing that. So we should identify the data gaps, especially when they result from the unwillingness of national authorities to contribute to the scoreboard. And I think also the Commission should bring more information in there gathered by professional organizations, such as the Venice Commission. We also recommend with Reconnect something about the EU's anti-fraud office, OLAF. We recommend that OLAF findings on corruption, which until now are only communicated discreetly to the member state in question, we recommend to render those findings public when member states are irresponsive to the mischiefs indicated in the reports, and introduce mechanisms of consequences attached to OLAF findings. And then there is also the idea of finding incentives for member states to join the EU Public Prosecutor's Office, a major new innovation with great potential. But you know, it's not something which all member states adhere to. It's not a coincidence, again, that Poland nor Hungary have acceded to it. The most tricky exercise which we are doing currently with regard to Reconnect at the end of our project are possible treaty changes. And that's really difficult. I'm not sure if you yourself are sometimes engaging in that exercises, like you as an academic or as a professional. How could or should the treaties be improved? We all know that treaty reform has in itself become some kind of mission impossible in today's European Union. But still, if we academics don't have the courage to think critically about the treaties, who else will do it? So we have a number of treaty changes proposals in the making. I already mentioned to you specifically with regard to Article 7, which again should, in our view, really be implemented more fully. It requires a number of changes both in Article 7.1, Article 7.2. It has to do with a number of things. For instance, clarify the scope of application. Article 7.1 is preventative, fine. But what is this clear risk for a violation? What's the difference with 7.2 and the actual happening of serious violations and so on? The role, for instance, of the European Parliament, which triggered the procedure against Hungary under 7.1, but is not accepted by the Council to really play a role in the actual procedures in the Council. The voting rules, as I said, it's impossible nowadays, with at least 2 member states backing each other up, to adopt any sanctions or findings under 7.2. So we have to go to something else. We are thinking of proposing a supermajority of 4/5 of member states. Again, you will know what happens with those proposed treaty changes. We are even considering suggesting the introduction of a forced expulsion mechanism. Bang, that's a big thing. We have already seen what Article 50 has generated, but still, I mean, you know that expulsion may sometimes, in really structural crisis, think of what happened now with Russia in the Council of Europe, it can sometimes be necessary. I'm also not saying this should be expulsion forever, but, you know, as a last resort, and so on and so forth. There are many more treaty, recommendations, but I'm not going to deal in it. I come to the last part of my presentation, which is enhancing the rule of law in the wider world. And as indicated already, the dynamics of backsliding in democracies and rule of law are absolutely not confined to the borders of the European Union. They reach far beyond. The Union, in a way, is just in interaction with a much larger international environment, which is increasingly characterized by rapid change, instability, very complex dynamics. And again, as demonstrated most shockingly and recently since the 24th of February, the new global reality is increasingly unaligned with the Union's foundational values and constitutional order. It forces the Union to really reflect and find ways and means of mitigating the impacts of these factors for its own internal organization, but also, of course, on how to influence international developments for the better. Again, I should say these dynamics are not entirely new, but they seem to have accelerated somewhat dramatically in recent times. We know already for a number of years that there are external threats to European democracies. They've taken multiple forms, including the deliberate disruptions of elections by third states or by non-state actors, aimed at influencing political systems, processes, institutions at the European, at the member state level, increasing political influence, fragmentation, disunity, distrust, trying to reinforce those tendencies that are actually already present within the EU. There are two broader global factors here. The general contestation of the liberal order as a result of the resurgence of authoritarianism in the world and or of populism. And secondly, the great transformation-induced anxiety that has resulted from worldwide issues such as climate change, demographic decline, technological revolutions, pandemics like COVID-19, all of them in a way resulting in a kind of subversion of trust in political institutions. In that challenging environment, which only has become more brutal and cynical in the last 3 weeks, how should the EU act? Notably as far as the promotion of the rule of law in the wider world is concerned. Many speakers yesterday and today have referred to Article 21, Article 3.5, the stated objective in 21 for the EU, and I quote, to advance the rule of law in the wider world. And it's quite something. An constitutional obligation for the Union to spread the rule of law in all of its international relations, actions and policies, the transversal nature of Article 21. I think so. It's not a question of if, it's a question rather of how. How in the current international context can the Union usefully, and I quote again from 21, define and pursue common policies and actions, work for a high degree of cooperation in all fields of international relations in order to consolidate and support democracy, the rule of law, human rights and the principles of international law. All of that beautiful language of Article 21 has become extremely, extremely topical right now. I wish I had more time to develop these fundamental questions. But since I don't have that much time now, I want to briefly develop some reflections on the EU's external relations toolkit and instruments. Now, in particular, I think it's useful to make a bit of a distinction between what I would call the unilateral or autonomous instruments of the EU, the bilateral ones, and the multilateral ones. And you have been touching on all these things, so I'm going to repeat certain things, but just try to put it a bit in a wider framework. In fact, unilaterally, we are really seeing a big boom of tools that are being developed recently also. We discussed them. Think of the EU Magnitsky Act, the EU sanctions with regard to cybersecurity, the proposed anti-coercion instrument, the new unilateral instruments to enforce the respect of international trade rules. Interestingly, also the discussions about the GSP plus, anything but arms, right? Human rights conditionality, which besides the European Commission now is taking more seriously, is enforcing more strictly vis-à-vis third countries. And then what we are currently seeing is amazing. In the past 3 weeks, we have seen various phases and stages and ever stronger intensity and extensity of restrictive measures taken against Russia. I think this is very interesting in the sense that they should offer us not just insights in the decision-making processes in the Council. Certainly much more is possible than used to be the case, compared, for instance, to the 2014 reaction to the annexation of Crimea. Much more is possible, apparently. But think of all the complexities involved, right? The scope, the coverage of those sanctions, questions whether they are really effective, whether they are not in some respects already disproportionately affecting certain industries, both in Europe and in Russia, parts of the Russian population. Think also of something quite remarkable, the unprecedented use of the European Peace Facility, which is also a very recent instrument. It's only operational since July 2021, and now suddenly hundreds of millions of euros are being used to basically supply lethal military material to Ukraine. I wonder what the pacifists in Europe will say about all of this. Are we going back in a certain way to the Roman maxim, si vis pacem para bellum? I hope not. But how will this current crisis affect the EU's actions, policies, practices with regard to all these tools and instruments? How will it also have an impact upon the future operationalization, and you know this is coming soon, of the so-called strategic compass? And this is not a complete picture. You may, still speaking of unilateral or autonomous measures, you may want to include also a careful reflection and assessment of past and current initiatives and programs regarding rule of law promotion in countries that were or are candidates for membership, the EU's neighborhood policy, it has been discussed, more widely, third countries in the world, where the EU, as you know, contributes with a lot of money to justice reform, to human rights issues, to transitional justice processes. I think we should look more deeply at the use that is being made and that is going to be made of those funding mechanisms regarding external rule of law promotion, especially now that we have a new external instrument, the Neighborhood Development and International Cooperation Instrument, Global Europe, under the new multi-annual budget, as you all know. There's already quite some literature, as we know, and it has been referred to in the past 2 days here, criticizing also the disconnect between the internal policies of the EU and the internal conceptualization of the rule of law and the external actions of the EU. Yes, you talk about different actors in a certain way. People in the EAS do not always know what people in other DGs in the Commission are doing, and so on and so forth. So there is a need of getting our act really much more together. This brings me to the bilateral level. And again, it's things we have touched upon. There is, of course, a considerable acquis of rule of law promotion in the international agreements that the EU has concluded with lots of third countries, from strategic trading partners such as Canada, Japan and South Korea, to the ACP countries. But these treaty frameworks, in my view, valuable as they may be, may need to be optimized for all the changes that we're seeing in the world. Not just to deepen our mutual commitment to rule of law and democracy, but also to deepen or to at least forge a stronger consensus on the way forward for the rule of law, not just within the EU, within those partner countries, but also regarding the joint promotion of rule of law within international organizations, international universal organizations from the UN to the WTO, but also regional and cross-regional organizations. And think also about the potential, although you can be very cynical about them, but I've always liked the so-called human rights dialogues between the EU and around 100 countries in the world. Very difficult. I've been myself an expert in some of those human rights dialogues, especially between the EU and China, and I can tell you stories that you would simply not believe. Last but not least, there is the Union's multilateral engagement and promotion of the rule of law, in particular at the United Nations. Well, there is something out there, many have forgotten about it, but there is a September 2012 declaration of the high-level meeting of the General Assembly on the rule of law at national and international levels. You may smile at it, you say, people have forgotten about that. But in fact, at the time, it was a major breakthrough, and the EU worked very hard to make it a meaningful instrument. And if you reread the paragraphs of that declaration, there's a lot of food and thought in it, and it has actually still an untapped potential. It's become a little bit forgotten because we had the 2015 Sustainable Development Goals, Agenda 2030, and so on and so forth, but still, at the time, were many pledges, commitments made, follow-up mechanisms that were going to be provided by the UN, and so on, and I think you should revisit that high-level declaration, especially with all the current challenges. I'm pretty sure that such a declaration could not be arrived at anymore in today's international context. But we have it. It's there since 2012. We should also reflect on how to improve our actions within the multilateral bodies that deal with issues of rule of law and human rights. And that's a big discussion. You can go from the Venice Commission, Council of Europe, to the global level. Think of the enormous contestation and actions, cleavages also, within the UN Human Rights Council, the Third Committee of the General Assembly in New York. But still, there is, in my view, a glimmer of hope. And I'm not sure if you're sharing it with me, but I have been very positively surprised to see in the past couple of weeks that the united system is actually still working in the face of Russia's aggression. Of course, the Security Council was not able to do anything for the well-known reasons. Strangely enough, that same Security Council has referred the matter under the Uniting for Peace mechanisms to the General Assembly, and then on the 1st of March, we saw the adoption of a General Assembly resolution that I recommend really reading to all of you, adopted with a very strong majority, 141 countries in favor, and really calling things by their name, explicitly condemning Russia for its aggression and invasion and the use of force. Well, I'm not sure if you have compared this, but in 2014 the General Assembly also adopted a resolution at the occasion of the annexation of Crimea. That was a very meek resolution, had a much lower number of member states supporting it, only slightly more than 100, and moreover it didn't even call Russia by name, you know. So I'm very happy that now, at least in 2022, the General Assembly has been much more forceful about that. And again, two days ago, the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, giving a rather forceful and remarkable order against Russia. So in that sense, the system is not broke. It can work. And of course, as we all know from all the past systemic challenges to international law, from 9/11 to what we are seeing since 24th of February, international law and international organizations are decidedly vulnerable to the brutality of big powers. But they also tend to show a resilience that is very often underestimated. And given the EU treaty commitment, again in the beautiful long Article 21, that the EU, and I quote, shall promote multilateral solutions to common problems, in particular in the framework of the United Nations, we can, and I think we should continue with the EU to work through multilateral channels at the regional, cross-regional and universal levels to promote the rule of law in what is increasingly a lawless environment. Doggedly, but in a determined manner. In the spirit of Guillaume le Taciturne, point n'est besoin d'espérer pour entreprendre, ni de réussir pour persévérer. Or to come back to my biblical language, for me the message for the European Union's rule of law promotion in international affairs should be duc in altum. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jan, for this suggestive, excellent lecture. I propose that we now take a few questions. So I see 1 and 2 hands there. May we please briefly?
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Professor Wolters, for the amazing lecture. There is something that you said that made me think about the proposals that you are going to do with Reconnect. You did not only mention the changes in the voting system of the Council regarding Article 7, but you also talked about an expulsion clause. This has triggered a bit of thought in me, because when I was doing my second master thesis, after analyzing all the tools, I realized, like, we have a problem because we have an Article 50, but we do not have an expulsion clause. But I remember that I gave up, I have to admit, after trying to do a revision of the rest of international organizations and what they did, and most of them didn't have one. And when they did, they didn't use it. But I have a question regarding this. Some people see Article 7, in the case of Article 7.3 being triggered and adopted, as an expulsion clause is itself, because what member state is going to stay in the European Union with no voting rights and no funding? My question goes, do you think that we could use a passerelle clause as portrayed in Article 48.7 to acquire the majority voting system that we need in the Council, so Article 7 can work and we avoid including an expulsion clause, but instead using the full power that Article 7 has? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. What a beautiful question. I would say, why don't you join us in reflecting on on our final recommendations, because this is, of course, essential. First of all, most international organizations do not have it, or do at least not use it. Well, you know, it exists in the UN, but the UN, of course, wants to be a universal organization, so it is not doing that, like the ILO and what have you. Like, there are quite a number of those global organizations which have it, but of course prefer to remain on speaking terms. It's always the idea, when they are in, you can talk with them and you can improve their behavior and so on. With regard to the Council of Europe, we have now seen that they have finally given up on Russia. And to be very honest, I mean, if you talk with your students, how can you indeed continue to defend membership of an organization that says that it is based on democracy, rule of law, and human rights protection, when also all freedom of the press is so completely curtailed, and so on and so forth? So I think in that sense it was probably unavoidable for the Council of Europe. So, but yes, the practice is very diverse, and I admit that. Speaking of the EU now, you know that the beautiful history of Article 50 TEU itself is a history basically about Article 7. It was written by the Convention into the treaty simply because one realized that if you have Article 7, and if indeed there will be such an impossible kind of gridlock with a member state under sanctions, then you have to offer an elegant way out to that member state by making it possible to voluntarily withdraw. The clause was even written, as you may know, by a British diplomat, right? And that British diplomat, Sir Ian Kerr, later, after the Brexit referendum, said, I could never imagine that this would ever be used by the United Kingdom. Okay, but that's just a side story. No, but I mean, Article 50 itself has in a way a close link to Article 7, and I think you make a right reference to Article 48. I think we have to try to change Article 7. Now, I'm pretty realistic about it. It will probably not happen. The very idea of an expulsion clause may also be something which quite a number of member states will really not like. But I'm afraid we have little choice to at least open a discussion about it. Also because, again, Article 7 is not fully operating, and to be honest, for us this expulsion clause is, if you wish, part of a larger discussion about a greater variety of sanctions. Now Article 7 only speaks about suspension of voting rights and so on. I think one should probably indicate a multiplicity or even a kind of scale, gliding scale of certain sanctions in case behavior is not improving, you see. And then in that sense, I think adding it will be, in my view, important. The EU is also, again, we have become a large union, very diverse. And again, the backsliding is such, that's what I wanted to show with my talk, the backsliding is such in a number of member states that it becomes more or less untenable for some to say that they are really sincerely committed to the foundational values of Article 2, you see. But thank you for the question.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Wouters, for your realistic and inspiring lecture. And well, I would like to bring into discussion because you mentioned the lack of trust of citizens. So I'd like to bring into discussion the Spitzenkandidaten system. Yeah, we also talked about this yesterday. But I really believe that, I mean, since this system was designed to replicate the national electoral system, well, I'm thinking that it obviously failed the last time it was used in 2019 election regarding the election of the Commission President. So I'm thinking that one of the problems was the fact that the citizens did not know who the candidates were, because if we compare how the debates, the electoral debates were in 2014, Jean-Claude Juncker, for example, participated in 4. This time there were only 2 debates between Weber and Timmermans. So I'm thinking of, was this just a problem of no existing electoral debates? Should the system be reformed so that citizens can maybe have more knowledge about this, but also so that the European Union can enhance its legitimacy and fight against this lack of trust that you have mentioned in your speech? And thank you very much.
Thank you. It's a part of our research that I have not been able to discuss, and it is part of the final recommendations that we also do with regard to democracy, the whole question of the Spitzenkandidat. To be honest, I hate the term. I find it not a beautiful kind of expression. I would rather say the lead candidate process, right? To put it in English, which is probably also not beautiful, but okay. You know the idea. And it has been tried indeed, and with some success in 2014. And in 2014, at least, the European Council went along with the idea. They were probably somewhat confronted by suddenly a kind of political consensus. But that was totally different in 2019. Monsieur Macron didn't really like it. Maybe some other member states behind the back of Monsieur Macron didn't like it either. In any event, what we have seen in this historically long European Council, which in the end then came up with Ursula von der Leyen, who had not even stood as a candidate in the European Parliament elections, was not a very, let's say, elevating example. So we are trying to make some proposals. They have to do with an idea which is not new, of course, of coming up with transnational electoral lists. We know that for that purpose you need to change the EU Electoral Act, which by itself is like a treaty change, because you also need ratification by all the member states. But we think it's going to be important. And then with regard to the actual lead candidate process, well, we're still reflecting on how to express that exactly. Personally, I'm in favor, but now I'm going to say rather something radical. I'm in favor, first of all, of merging the office of the President of the European Commission with the President of the European Council. Big bang, people may scandalize, you may start throwing stones at me, but this is not something totally unfeasible, neither unthought of, because this actually, if you read the convention processes in the times of 2002, 2003, actually the treaty was written in a way to allow this even without a treaty change. So as such it is possible, whether you like it or not. I've personally for a long time thought, no, the Commission and its supranational nature is sacrosanct. We can never have that Commission President being in the intergovernmental organ of the European Council as a president and so on. I think I've changed my mind because we have seen some interesting incidents, Sofagate and Sofagate 2.0 and so on. So I mean, for me, in a certain way, those incidents, and if you know a little bit about the fights and the lack of chemistry between those two personalities, but for me, it actually shows, why do you need always two of them? And continuing to say, the one is for the supranational EU, and the other one, as the treaty says, the President of the European Council is there to represent the EU at his level and in that capacity for CFSP. Well, to be honest, I think we may want to rationalize that a little bit. And if you do that, again, that's very radical, but you don't even need a treaty change. But what if you then make the candidates for that merged office directly electorable? That's a big bang, and I'm not saying that this will happen, but for me it could be a way of making the European elections much more interesting, doing away with what I call the second order nature of European elections, always subordinated to national debates and so on, and really put important issues on the table and have debates all over the EU. So I mean, I'm not saying it's a miracle solution, but I think we have to be creative also as a kind of further elaboration of the ideas behind the Spitzenkandidaten system. Thank you.
Is there any last question? Yes, you have.
I would like if you could answer me this question. Mr. Putin has made big changes in all thoughts and all international organizations, not only in United Nations, Europe, but do you think it would be possible that Mr. Putin will finally be at the International Criminal Court of Justice? That's one thing. The second thing, what's going on in New York in Assemblea is that this veto and the power of Russia and China, so it is another changing of thoughts. And all this going on with a politician is so close to the European Union. So at the end of the day, it's like, is that Europe giving real solutions to something is so close? And the third question is, within the population that is in Russia, is it Europe doing enough? Because, for example, one of the persons that's been in prison is a lady that she's 80, and she's a Sakharov Prize Nobel. She's been defending the human rights, and it's been by this prize, and she's been in prison. So, what's the future on how you see this? Thank you.
Wow. Okay, first, Vladimir Putin. Well, first of all, I appreciate the fact that you mentioned the International Criminal Court, because let's face it, the International Criminal Court is an important instrument for international rule of law. And it's also explicitly mentioned in that high-level declaration of the General Assembly of 2012 that I was referring to. And you may also know that it's a standard part of EU foreign policy for 20 years now, that the EU is supportive of the ICC, and that we have always tried, but I would say with mixed success, to convince countries to become members of the ICC. The EU is always trying to convince countries join the ICC so that instead of the current 123 countries, the ICC may become a more universal organization. Because you know very well, Russia is not a member, the United States is not part, India is not part, China is not part. So in terms of the great powers, we are really missing out. And especially in Asia, I'm a little bit concerned that we need more countries to sign up for the ICC. If you look on the world map, you will see the whole of the European Union, North America, both Canada and Mexico, the whole of Latin America, big parts of Africa, not everything, but especially Asia, and it shows you something about also the vision on international law and on international criminal law in some Asiatic countries. But so coming back to Mr. Putin, as I said, Russia is not a party. There is an interesting story here. I'm not sure if you know that, but initially, like the United States, Russia had signed the Rome Statute, and they have basically withdrawn their signature in 2016, when, as a reaction to the annexation of Crimea, Ukraine made a declaration giving jurisdiction to the ICC, and so then in 2016, Russia said, okay, no problem, we simply withdraw and we will never ratify this statute. So cooperation from Russia for an ICC investigation, I think we can forget about that. Anyway, I mean, Mr. Putin is very good at always referring to the other hegemon, the United States. I'm not sure if you have read his address to the Russian nation from the 24th of February. It's the most toxic attack you can imagine on the West and on the United States. But basically, he's referring to previous, let's say, international brutalities of the United States, including the 2003 invasion of Iraq. And yeah, you know what attitudes the Bush administration, but also the Trump administration have taken against the International Criminal Court. So in that sense, Mr. Putin, when he denies any form of cooperation with the ICC, he is not alone. He's not the only big power that, in a way, does not make the system of international criminal law work. So I'm afraid it may not happen. But the good news is that indeed we have had nearly 40 countries recently referring the situation in Ukraine to the ICC, triggering an investigation of the new public prosecutor. I'm told that there are already people from the prosecutor's office in Ukraine doing investigations, documenting on war crimes and so on. You may have also seen that now increasingly some countries themselves are starting to investigate war crimes. The US has said that recently. There are already investigations also taking place in Germany, I'm told. So I mean, there are countries, not just the ICC, but there are also countries documenting really the war crimes that are happening on a daily basis, I'm afraid to say. And at some stage, if not Mr. Putin, then at least somebody else in that hierarchy of command will, I think, be brought before justice. At the national level, at the ICC level, we don't know yet, but it will happen, I think. And that is for me also very important, to show the resilience of the international system. The crime of aggression has been committed. It's been committed by Russia, but let's not forget that there is an accomplice next door, which is Belarus. And so no, there are serious issues here, and I think the ICC can play a role. But remember, the whole edifice of the ICC is one of complementarity, so also the national courts of the ICC's countries can play a very important role. And I hope it has a follow-up to show also in a sense that international criminal law will not tolerate this. I've answered your question on Putin. Hopefully, Russia and China in the UN, well, in a way it's a bigger discussion about, how shall we call that? They have been working together closely for many years now. This is not new. Of course, what is now new is this kind of declaration that Mr. Putin got from Mr. Xi just at the beginning of the Olympic Games. Remember that there are no limits to the friendship, and the fact whether there are indeed no limits to that friendship will have to be proven now when it is about China's attitude to what is happening in Ukraine. You know that they have been totally silent. You know that they have not voted against They have not voted against, they have abstained at the time of the General Assembly resolution. But that silence cannot continue. If you are a big power, you cannot continue to act as if nothing is happening out there. And it also flies in the face of China's most sequential foreign policy principle, which is, let there be respect for sovereignty, by which they also mean you respect our sovereignty, you don't criticize our human rights record, but at least it also presupposes that you're not simply invading other countries. Little footnote, Taiwan is of course not an other country in the eyes of China, but that's just a little footnote. Okay, so and then the Russian population, I'm a little bit afraid that we as Europeans, the EU, but also countries and ourselves, citizens in the EU, we have just not a sufficient understanding of Russia. I think it's a major mistake. I don't know how to blame it. You know that once upon a time, for those who remember the Cold War, every decent university had a center on Marxism and on the Soviet Union and so on. Many of those things totally disappeared after the Cold War, but I'm a little bit afraid to say that we understand Russia today far too little. And the attitude of citizens, the way in which the society has evolved. And what are our tools to affect the Russian population, except for the brutal tool of the sanctions? I think we cannot operate there. You know that there is also Russian legislation which explicitly prohibits the funding of civil society organizations by external donors such as the EU or the US, because if you do that, then those civil society actors have to put on their business card, I am a foreign agent. There is binding Russian legislation about that. So, I would rather say we have to urgently start to better understand Russia in its totality, including with its population. It's almost incredible, I would say, with hindsight, that this happened with us being surprised that it happened. We could have foreseen this long ago, in a certain way. It's not coming out of the blue. Remember what happened in the summer of 2008, Georgia. Remember 2014. Remember already at the end of the 1990s, the brutal war in Chechnya. So these things are not coming out of the blue. But I'm a little bit afraid that we have, in a certain way, we have underestimated this, and that we have continued to do what we like to do, is saying, well, we just trade and working together and having the globalization doing its work. We will see the rise of a critical civil society, middle class and so on, and so they will become like us. The same mistake as we made with China besides. And so I think it's a wake-up call for us to really urgently start investing again in a deeper understanding of those countries. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Jan. We will not further abuse your generosity. It has been a brilliant end for this conference. Before we go, let me apologize, because there was a mistake in the program that Jan just noticed to me. We were 1 hour before the closing keynote lecture supposed to have the keynote, so we have envisaged 2 hours and a half instead of 1 hour and a half for the last panel, which was not our intention. So some people might have been mistaken by the time that we have put as the beginning of the keynote lecture. Fortunately, we did it wrong with the time at which we would end the keynote lecture, because there we have had the right time. But in any case, I apologize for that. It was a silly mistake that we did when printing the program. There will be no closing ceremony, so I hope that this conference was worth the effort that you have made to attend it. So you're free to go wherever you want, but before you go, I'd like to ask you one thing on behalf of Carmela Pérez Bernardez and myself. Let's give a big applause to the members of the organizing committee: Otsana Olario, Amelia Díaz Pérez de Madrid, Francisco Cuesta Rigo, Antonio Sánchez Ortega, Rafael Marín Aiz, and Ada Gabrila, and to the student volunteers led by Inés that have made possible this conference. Thank you very much. So thank you to everybody and safe travels.